Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Dr. Waddell, to you and your students for this opportunity, because this is something that I really value, this conversation with students, this conversation in this community type setting. So I'm appreciative of this opportunity to do this. My name is Lillian Gomez, and I am an educator and have been an educator for about 36 years. And my background is one that started in elementary education, so I've taught elementary school, and I have taught middle school, and I've taught high school, and I've taught in higher ed. So it's really spanned the whole, K-12, K-16 spectrum. And the focus of my work has always been this whole notion of advocating for students who have had, lack of opportunity, lack of access, students of color. African American students, indigenous students, Latino students, those students whom, unless there is somebody at the table strongly advocating for their inclusion into this education process, that sometimes it doesn't reach that. So I've really paid attention to that in my career of 36 plus years of teaching. And through that time have had just enormous opportunities and success. I did grow up here in the Valley. I'm a native Valley person, grew up in Colorado. I have roots in my community back to the San Luis area, where I can look back at 7 generations of my family. So I always let people know, although I have much appreciation for individuals who have immigrated here from other countries, Mexico, South America, different areas of the world, that I do not come from a family of immigrants. I have always lived here, and I say, I didn't cross the border crossed me. Because that is specifically what happened to my family. We've always lived here. They lived here before Mexico, when this was part of Mexico still, and before, the line was drawn by the U.S. government, and then, pushed out Mexico and kept Colorado, Arizona, California, Texas. So I have a long history a long historical history here in the Valley. And so was educated here at Adams State, did my undergraduate work here, and I did my master's work here. And then I pursued and began my PhD work at the University of California, Santa Barbara, in which I did not accomplish, but had a wonderful 2 years really immersing myself in what it meant to be a doctorate student. So that's kind of just very briefly who I am.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit about what your family did here in the Valley and their connections with the land and the community here?
Okay, so my grandfather comes from a family of ranchers in the San Luis area, and so of course he owned huge portions of property in the San Luis, which is part of the San Cristo land grant, right? So he farmed. My mother comes from that ranching family where they raised sheep and they raised cattle, and they raised different kinds of livestock. They farmed as well. There was a huge farming area in San Luis where they grew, which I thought was different. They grew cauliflower. So my grandfather was a huge grower of cauliflower, and this cauliflower was shipped all over the country. This was kind of the central location. So my grandfather owned this farm, and he had many sons who helped him run the farm in San Luis. And then World War II came, and of the 5 sons that he had, 4 of them were taken and actually pushed it and drafted into World War II. So my grandfather stayed without any help, and at that time most of the men in the area had to go off to war, so my grandfather didn't have the resources in which to continue to grow his livestock, to be able to continue the farming piece, and as a result of that, a lot of the land was lost to taxes. So that's my that's the 7 generations. My family in the San Luis area held many political offices. My grandfather was one of the first superintendents of schools. It was a Catholic school in the area of San Luis, but my grandfather was the superintendent of schools. My aunts and uncles held political office in the area. So we've always come from a family of leaders, a family of leadership, of knowing that giving back to community is essential in who we are as a people. And so I grew up with that understanding that you are politically involved, you give back to your community, you serve your community, because that's the background that my family came from. My grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, his name was Pilar Mondragon. He and his brother, Celedonio Mondragon, from the Antonito area, also began one of the first labor unions in the United States, and it was called Protección Mutua de Trabajadores Unidos, Sociedad Mutua de Trabajadores Unidos. It's known as the SpMDTU. And my great-grandfather was instrumental in beginning this labor union. And this labor union was started to begin and to protect the rights of the Mexican people and the Mexican worker, and it really was a lot around water rights, because what had happened is a lot of the water was being taken away from the people. And so they started this SpMDTU, which is still today a nationally recognized labor union in this country. And so those are the roots in which I come from.
So are you and your family still members of this?
We are. My husband is. My husband is still a member of the SpMDTU, and we still have all of the original documents. My mother still has them, and I have them all framed, all of the original documents and the declaration and the books and all of that. Of course, at that time, it was an organization for men only, and women participated on the periphery, of course. But my grandfather and my great-grandfather, of course, were much more open. And I knew it through my grandfather's stories, because, of course, by the time I was born, my great-grandfather, Pilar Mondragon, and his brother, Celedon Mondragon, had already passed away. But it's the interest of that says, you have to be community-centered, community-minded, community-organized. And I think I brought some of that work into the university, that passion, that importance, that vitality of interest into how do we continue to create that climate, that community, so that students can continue to prosper and grow.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your experience working with Hispanic children when you were in the education system? Absolutely.
It was very early on. And again, it was about about the advocacy for children who look like me, and children who probably were experiencing very much the same experience of going to school as a non-English speaker, speaking another language other than English. And so I started my career at Alamosa Public Schools. At that time, there was a agenda, or there was a conversation at the district level where they were getting ready to desegregate schools, because the schools in Alamosa were segregated, correct? So you had Polston that was on the east side, you had Boyd that was on the south side, and then you had some that were on the north side. And it was very, very much cut across the town demographically, where poor Latino students attended Boyd Elementary, and students with more resources, and mostly white students, then went to what is Central now, our East Campus. And then more of a mixture over at Polston. And then our students gathered together at Ortega Middle School and then the high school. But the early elementary grades were severely segregated schools by race and also by socioeconomic status. So you could walk into Boyd Elementary and see that the resources there, the payment of the teachers, the access of materials to students, was very different than if you came to Central over where East Campus is now. And so there was a lawsuit filed by the federal government who said you must desegregate schools. And so Alamosa Public Schools at that time, in conversation with the Board of Education, said, how do we approach this? If we start, can we bus kids from the north side that have never been to the south side to integrate students? Much like what was happening in communities all over the country, right, with busing students across lines and trying to integrate those students, and then having the students then from the south side come to the north side. So that seemed like a mess for the school district. So another plan was devised, and the plan that was devised was this: we would send K1 students over to Polston, we would send 2-3 students over to Boyd, and we would send 4-5 students over to Central. And then they would gather again like they always had in middle school and high school. It was their easy solution. That way everybody moved in the community, and no one parent was unhappy with, why does my child have to go to the north side or the south side? And that was my introduction. That was my introduction to that kind of system. And so I spent the next several years at Alamosa Public Schools helping them implement that plan.
Can you share a little with us about your experience, if at all, working with immigrants who've come to this area and their education?
Oh, absolutely. Very early on, and I was working at Alamosa Public Schools, I get a call from the superintendent. He says, Lillian, we don't know what to do. And I said, what's going on? Dr. Johnston was his name. And I said, what's going on? And he said, well, we just have these newly arrived students. They look Hispanic, he said, but they aren't. He said, and they speak this very different language. And it's almost an indigenous language. He said, but they're here under the protection of the Catholic Church. They have to have access to public education. And they were our very first students that Alamosa Public Schools had that were from Guatemala. So they were the Guatemalan population that had come in. And of course, you know, in Guatemala, Spanish was their official language, right? And then of course they spoke then their Mayan language. But most of them spoke Mayan language with very little Spanish. So we then, some of these students had never been in a public school. Some of these students, because they had lived in Guatemala where it was young, had never really worn shoes that were closed, had worn sandals, and had never really dressed and been prepared for the winter weather. And they were the very first, there was 26 students who enrolled at Alamosa Public Schools. And so there were a team of us who were assigned to kind of meeting with and supporting this newly arrived group of students from Guatemala. And so not knowing any better, really, that the only language that we had to converse with these students was Spanish, because we didn't speak the Mayan language, right, and which was Canjoval, right, because that was the language that they spoke, was Canjoval. But the parents, and especially the fathers, had enough Spanish that we could converse with them. And some of these students have been very successful, you know, not as many as we needed to have, but many of the young men and women graduated from Alamosa Public Schools and then went on to higher education. Brilliant, brilliant people, and welcoming, and I think one of the challenges was to have them understand the whole kind of cultural piece and how it, you know, what its intersectionality of that was, because when some of the girls then reached the 18 of 14 and 15, well, they, in their cultural piece, they were ready to be married, right? And a lot of them were arranged marriages. Well, we had to work with the families to have them have an understanding that that was something in the United States that they couldn't do. And so we had to do this, it was this very slippery slope of how do you honor the culture in which they come from, and what do you do with then the legal piece of the United States and what that looks like. And we can't marry off our girls at 12 and 13 years old, because that's not what we do. And their appreciation and understanding from that, and yet how it impacted their cultural view and their cultural values.
That's really interesting. I'd never really thought about it from that perspective.
Right. And you know that most of the families worked at the mushroom farm. So, you know, we would say, you know, well, we would like to visit with these parents for them to come to parent-teacher conferences. And of course, if you're being paid by every, you know, bucket of mushrooms that you are picking, it's not always your opportunity, or it's not an opportune time for you to take off in the middle of the day at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock to go for a parent-teacher conference. And so also acclimating the school district to say we need to think differently about this with these parents. So we held parent-teacher conferences over at the mushroom farm. And we worked very closely with the directors there, and we said, look, just give them 15, 20 minutes and shift them out. And so we would take our team of teachers there for a day, and the district would support their salary and get a sub so that we could go to the parents and meet with them. And of course, they were as interested as any parent would be about their child's education. It's not that, and then of course they trusted us, but we created just a very positive relationship with the Guatemalan community. You know, very early on, I read this piece of literature that was just amazing to me, and it said that if you look at people who have really been successful, and I had every wish, every notion, every hope of having this success in my career, that it said that if you look at those individuals, those mostly are people who have kept ties to their culture and kept ties to their language. So I started researching people. Different Latinos, different, people who speak another language other than English. And every single time, those people were fluent in their language and had kept strong cultural ties. So knowing that, I knew the importance of maintaining my language and maintaining my culture if success is what I wanted at the end. And I will tell you that 9 times out of 10, when I've competed for positions, when I've competed for jobs, and that it's been equal to everybody, but what pushes me over the top is that I speak Spanish and I have a strong cultural background and heritage to who I am as a Latina. But the Spanish that is spoken here many times, so if I'm speaking with my mother, she and I carry our conversations all in Spanish. So I will speak with my mother completely in Spanish. But my mother, when she speaks to me, a lot of the times does the code switching, right? She'll use like 2 or 3 words in Spanish, and then she'll kind of put in a English word, and then she'll kind of finish the term, then she'll kind of finish it in Spanish. Well, the research calls that code switching, right? And that means but if you look at the language, if you look at what is spoken, like in the area of San Luis, if you just look at the language that they use, it's all grammatically correct. So they conjugated the verbs, the tenses, and so they're able to do that really, really well. What we know about that is that only very, very, very good speakers or very well-developed speakers of English and Spanish can do that. So you have to know the language well in order to be able to code switch. I can't do that. I speak to you in Spanish or I speak to you in English. I can't code switch. But the best users of language in this community can, and it's fascinating to hear that. So that's what my mother does, Now, if she sees you and she knows that you might be Hispanic and speak Spanish, she'll speak to you in Spanish and use this code switching language. But if she sees that you may not be a Spanish speaker, then she'll speak to you in English. For the longest time, I have really always been what I call trying to reach this level of what I call equity mindedness. How do we advocate for equity, right? So how do we look at equity with race, class, gender, and sexual orientation? That has been pivotal in my thinking in my community. And so while in this tight-knit community, we still were experiencing racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, right? We said, how do we inform this tight-knit community of thoughts, of beliefs outside of this? So that was my work at the University of California, Santa Barbara, was to really look at this. And what I know now, although I have a very tight-knit community in which I go to sustain me, to rejuvenate me, to to build me sometimes when I'm tired. And that's the community of San Luis, where everybody knows everybody and everybody, supports you, and no matter, this unconditional support that you get. We still needed to think about those kinds of issues. So what I started to do in my work was really look at allies in this work. That I know that we're not going to solve the issue around sexism if in fact we don't invite men into the conversation. We're not going to solve the issue of racism if we don't invite a diverse population to have the conversation. We're not going to solve the issue of homophobia if in fact we don't have people who are straight in the conversation. Those are the advocates and the allies. So I look at it as a tight-knit community, yes, but I see it beyond that. And that when we create this dialogue, it has to be among white men, white women, people of color, rich and poor. We're not going to inform classism in the way we need to inform classism if we don't invite the affluent into the conversation.